All right, everyone, now it's time to talk about theories that we're going to be using in this class specifically for the purpose of working with families. There's going to be two of them, but one of the things that I want to cover first is kind of general theories for family systems theory. And so the two that we're going to be looking at are going to be related to how we apply family systems theory in an intervention, whether it's to try to help improve reading, whether it's to try to help improve nutritional or health outcomes, or some educational outcome, or mental health outcome. So we will get going on those. The general family systems terms you should probably all know. And if you don't already know these, they're pretty straightforward, but you will need to know them for the exam. The terms for kind of general family systems theory, the primary one, or one of the first ones that we'll talk about, is homeostasis. Homeostasis is really the tendency of families to not change. Boundaries are who does what and who has the ability to do what. Hierarchies, clearly what those are is the difference between parents and children and who has the ability to make powers. You all have roles in your families and rules that govern the families, and so we'll talk briefly about each one of these. Homeostasis, again, is the tendency to resist change. How does this influence problems? Think about for a minute what happens when a child starts school and parents have a difficult time. Or think about when you left for college. Maybe you were the first person to leave for college and parents had a tough time letting you go. Or maybe you were the last person to leave for college and they equally had a tough time letting you go. Think about how those changes, those times of major change in the family affect things. And we'll talk more when we talk about structural family systems theory, that how that plays out in his mind. Boundaries, regulations that govern the interactions of families. These can either be rigid or they can be too loose and diffused. What impact will it have if they're too rigid? What happens in families when their boundaries are rigid? And then further, the children move away to college. You see a lot of rebellion. You see a lot of inability to manage one's decisions and stuff like that when the boundaries have been rigid. And when the boundaries have been loose and diffused, there just is a lack of boundaries. There's a failure to be able to make a distinction between what's appropriate and what's not, healthy or unhealthy. Hierarchy, this is important, the layering of the family. And in family systems theory, it doesn't look at hierarchy as a negative thing or as a problem thing. What it looks at it as is that hierarchy is the way that the stability is maintained in the family, and those are necessary changes. There can be unhealthy hierarchies, and structural family systems theory will look at that, as well as the Bowenian we'll look at. Roles, who does what? Who's the caretaker, the responsible one, ambitious one? Think for a minute about which role you have in the family and how that affects your decision to go into this profession, how it affects your decision to do any number of things. Roles dictate how we act. The rules, who can do what. Sometimes these are explicit and sometimes these are implicit. A lot of times when you're working with families and they have really implicit rules that are inconsistent with the context of what's going on, it's tremendously powerful to make those implicit rules explicit. And how you do that is you talk about how did that decision get made, and then they'll say, well, you can't do that in my family. That's not something we do. And then you ask, well, where did that come from? And so you can dig to try to understand, where are these rules coming from? You may be working with a family who doesn't believe that it's their job as parents to do education. And so you'd have to talk about, where did that implicit rule that it's not our responsibility, or that it's overstepping our responsibility and bounds to do that. Now we're going to take a break, and I want you to think about some of the perceptions that you have, and then we'll come back and talk about theories.